What would you do if an armed person were reported to you? What would you do if a fire were reported to you? What would you do if a violent person who was not armed was reported to you? We hope at the conclusion of this special 8-part series related to mall security, you'll have some answers to those questions. We'll be looking at some duties and responsibilities the security officer has in providing for the public safety. Some objectives to keep in mind when dealing with any situation, including an emergency situation, is that the security officer's primary duty is the protection of persons. Number 2, he needs to protect property. And number 3, he needs to enforce mall rules and regulations. The prioritization of your thoughts related to responding to emergencies should be in that sequence. The security officer should keep in mind that in order to effectively respond to emergencies, as with any other situation, he needs to have preconsidered what he would do. And we hope at the conclusion of this program, you will feel that we have helped you to think through those situations and consider some of the things that security officers should do in dealing with emergencies. Consistently effective emergency responses are not possible without pre-planning and pre-training. Security officers are trained by their organizations, but the responsibility for training doesn't simply rest with the organization. Security officers need to familiarize themselves with possible scenarios and to be familiar with the rules and regulations that govern how they respond to emergencies. Security officers must be aware of their surroundings and what conditions may be involved in emergency responses. Pre-planning is not possible sometimes at the time the emergency happens. Pre-planning needs to have occurred in the officer's own mind prior to the initiation of the problem. The security officer, who is thoroughly trained and has prepared himself by thinking through the scenarios of emergencies that he may be confronted with, will be a much more effective security officer in dealing with emergencies.
Well, what gives you the right to be out all night long with a sick kid?
It's your job to stay home and take care of the baby.
No, it's not my job. Don't even hand me that crap.
It's your job. If I'm going to go out with my friends, I'm going to go out with my friends. And you're not going to stop me.
You want to make a bet?
Yeah.
You want to make a bet?
Yeah.
You want to live a bachelor life? You need to go and do it, and you'll do it without me, and you'll do it without the kid. You'll do it without the kid!
Excuse me. Could you step over here? Please step over here. Let me talk to you for a minute.
What?
What seems to be the problem, ma'am?
I have a problem with him. He's out all night, every night. I'm home taking care of a baby by myself. It's ridiculous, and I'm tired of it. And I'm not putting up with it, and I'm letting him know that.
Okay, let me talk to him. So obviously you're out all night.
In the scene you have just witnessed, the officer responded and actually made things worse. The reason that things were worse after the officer responded was because he didn't understand what his purpose was in being there. He wasn't there to adjudicate a long-standing family dispute. His purpose in being there was to cause peace on the property. Now let's take a look at the same scene with a correct response.
This is ridiculous. The fact that you're out 4 and 5 nights a week and I'm home taking care of this baby, I'm tired of it.
If I want to go out, I'm going to go out. You're not going to stop me from going out with my friends. I work 10 hours a day.
No.
And you're not going to stop me from going out with my friends and having a drink.
I'm not going to work 40 hours a week and take care of a baby 40 hours a week. No, it's not my job.
Excuse me. Yes. Ma'am, sir. Can I talk to you for a minute? If you'd step over here, and I'd like you to step over here just a second.
Yes, sir.
Ma'am, this is a shopping center, and this is disruptive activity. I'd love to suggest that you just take this someplace else, preferably home or out of the mall.
Yes, sir.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Let me talk to your husband a minute.
Okay.
Sir, as I told your wife, this is a shopping mall, and this is disrupting the activity of the mall. And I'd like to suggest you take this elsewhere, home or someplace out of the mall.
Yeah, we can do that.
Thank you, sir.
In this scene, the security officer quickly realized that he may be dealing with a potentially violent situation. He quickly asked for assistance. The presence of the second officer on the scene was influential in the successful resolution of this problem. The security officer quickly separated the parties who were arguing, and he asked them to take their dispute to another location. The quick thinking of the security officer in this scenario was very instrumental in a quick, peaceful, successful resolution of this problem. Now let's think about some other possible emergency responses that security officers might need to make. Among them is fire.
Officer, there's a fire in the food court.
Where did you see that?
There was black smoke coming from underneath the door down there.
Do you know which door or anything? Where did you saw?
Back in the hallways, back by the restrooms.
Okay, all right. 202 to 201. I'm responding to a fire in the food court. A report of a fire in the food court. I need you to send the fire department.
201's clear, check and advise.
Copy.
In this scene, we see a security officer who has a fire reported to him. His first response is to advise someone with access to a telephone to summon emergency help. Once the fire department has been summoned, the security officer should proceed to the scene of the fire. If he has a clear idea from the person who reported to him where the fire is exactly, he would respond without the person. If the person who is reporting the fire to him is excited or gives unclear instructions or directions as to where the fire may be, then that person would probably need to be asked to go with the security officer to show him the location of the fire. Once he is at the scene of the fire, he should make several determinations. He should, first of all, see immediately the size of the fire. He should try to determine what material is actually burning. He should also consider how quickly the fire may respond, whether any persons are in immediate danger and would require evacuation, and he should also consider making sure that this information is accurately and timely provided to the responding fire units. This information can be absolutely critical in the correct handling of this situation.
201's clear on the fire in the food court en route to Race Street to meet the fire department.
So far, we've talked about accurately reporting the fire. There are two steps that security officers should consider taking while the emergency response is coming. The first is to go out and physically direct responding fire personnel to the scene of the fire so that their response is made as quick as possible.
Got a report of a fire on the food court.
The second is to take any reasonable steps that can safely be done to contain the spread of the fire. Frequently, it's possible that fires are extinguished prior to the arrival of emergency equipment. But safety is the issue. Remember our priorities. The safety of persons is paramount. If anyone will be imperiled by so doing, then the fighting of the fire should be left to the emergency response team. In our next segment, we'll take a look at what you would do or could do to handle an armed person.
Hey, sir, can I find anything?
I was wondering where Star Bank was.
Well, if you go right around the corner here by the main entrance, sir, it's there on the left.
Okay.
Okay? 201 dispatch.
Look familiar? Have you been in this situation before? What would you do? The security officer now suspects that the person he's talking to is armed. What does he do? The first thing he does is politely and as discreetly as possible withdraw from any continued contact with that person. The security officer, after all, is unarmed. He then should withdraw to a safe distance. He should cause the police to be contacted and let them know several things that they will want to know to make their safe and their response as safe as possible and the handling of this situation successful. The first thing they would want to know, and that the information you should supply, is what does the person look like? What reason do you have to suspect that they are armed? any indication that you might have that the person actually intends to use his or her weapon.
Hey, sir, can I find anything?
I was wondering where Star Bank was.
Well, if you go right around the corner here to the main entrance, it's right there on the left.
Okay.
Okay? 201 dispatch. Dispatch, I got possible male with a gun on the level 1 retail. Be a white male in a dark suit. Could you request police for me?
From a discreet distance, the officer should observe the movements of this individual and continually update responding police as to his location.
I don't owe you anything.
Man, I want my money, man.
You're not getting any money because I don't owe you anything, man. What is the deal?
Man, what is wrong with you pushing on me, man?
Man, because I'm tired of your...
Man, I'm going to throw you over that counter somewhere.
Man, you are not. Come on. What do you think this is, man? I don't owe you anything. I'm not giving you anything, man. You want to be in the phone?
While patrolling your property, have you seen this? Does this look familiar? What would you do? Let's consider for a minute the handling of non-armed violent persons.
What is it, man? I don't have any money. I'm not giving you any money. No way, man. Right here. I'm putting you in the phone right now. Right now. Come on. What are you...
First thing that this security officer would want to do is to report the situation as he observes it to a fellow officer. He would probably want to have that fellow officer assist him with handling this situation. We then would approach the people who are arguing and attempt to, by our presence, influence them into ceasing their disorderly, violent behavior. If our approach has failed to do that, then a simple, polite request would be in order. It's very important to note that the manner that the officer communicates his request may be as important as the words he uses. A professional, authoritative, yet calm approach probably would do a lot to diffuse this situation. However, unfortunately, some people will not be dissuaded in their behavior. The officer should then escalate his approach into asking the individual to leave the property, telling him that that kind of behavior is not tolerated. If he refuses that, then police should be summoned to handle this individual.
Guys, you're going to have to take it elsewhere. This is disruptive in the mall. You're going to have to take it elsewhere.
I don't owe him any money.
Well, that's fine. But you're going to have to take it elsewhere. It's disruptive in the mall, okay?
Only as a very last resort, and only when persons are physically threatened with harm should this person be restrained. The individual would be first asked to desist, first asked to leave the property, then physical detention only if no other steps would be effective. And prior to the detention, we would want to make provisions for asking persons who might be harmed by this individual to move out of the immediate vicinity for their own protection.
Ma'am, excuse me. We can't allow anybody to throw any objects off of this balcony. I might have to ask you to stop.
Why? It's not hurting anybody.
Well, unfortunately, even though it's early, we still have a lot of pedestrian traffic, so you might accidentally hit somebody.
It's a public place.
I realize that, but I'm still going to have to ask you to stop.
The act you've just seen is not a violation of law. However, it is against mall rules. The question becomes, how do we gain compliance with the least intrusive method available to us? The method I'm going to suggest to you is called a compliance continuum. We call it that because the officer gains compliance through the use of the least intrusive method. It is not necessary in all cases that the officer even discuss the issue with the violator. Quite frequently, it is sufficient only if the officer's presence is known. In this method, many of you may be using already, but you haven't had a label for it. If the presence of the officer is not adequate, then we would suggest that the officer approach and politely request that the individual comply. However, let's return to our scenario and see what happens.
Ma'am, excuse me. We can't allow anybody to throw any pennies or any kind of objects off of this height of a building here, so I'm going to have to ask you to stop.
Okay.
Okay? Thanks.
In our force continuum, it is absolutely essential that the officer not break contact with the violator until compliance is obtained. This sends a verbal signal to the violator that the officer will not retreat until compliance is gained. This in and of itself may be sufficient to cause compliance.
Ma'am, excuse me. I can't allow you to throw any objects off of this balcony.
Why? It's not hurting anybody.
Well, even though that is a public fountain, you're still 3 levels up. I'm gonna have to ask you to stop. Somebody could walk out and get hit.
This is a public place.
Ma'am, I realize it's a public place, but you can't throw it from this level. I'm gonna have to ask you to stop.
I'm not leaving.
Ma'am, either you leave or else I'm gonna have to dispatch a police officer.
I'm not.
202 to dispatch.
Dispatch, go ahead.
Send me a police officer to level 2.
If the person violating the rules at this point continues to refuse to obey, then it may be necessary that this person be ejected from the mall, which would be the next step in our compliance continuum.
Hi, ma'am. I'm gonna have to ask you to stop throwing things from this level. You're free to do it from down there by the fountain, but you can't do it from up here.
But this isn't hurting anybody.
I realize that, but somebody could walk out in front of you, and it's just a mall policy I'm gonna have to ask you to conform to.
Well, I'm not stopping.
Ma'am, either you stop or I'm gonna have to ask you to leave the mall.
I'm not leaving this mall.
Okay, ma'am. 202 to dispatch. Sir, if you would send me a police officer to the 2nd level up by Added Dimensions. Copy.
It might be helpful at this stage to talk about some of the common behaviors which would cause people to be asked to desist from that behavior. For examples, you might consider the intoxicated person, or a person who is loud, abusive, threatens others, or who makes comments to persons not known to them that would likely not be welcome.
Come here, honey. Hey, come on over here. I want somebody to talk to. Come on. Don't be scared. Come on over here.
301, 303.
Nobody's gonna get you. Come here. Come on over here. Huh?
Let me help you here.
What? No.
Here, let me help you here.
Other examples of behavior that might require security attention would be persons who remain essentially in one location and or who block locations that are not designed for eating or waiting, such as corridors, stairways, or other places of travel. Other persons who might require mall attention are persons who attempt to conceal themselves either from security or from the common observation of the general public. It can easily be assumed that such persons are up to no good. The second is persons who constitute a threat to the well-being and order of the mall. This activity doesn't have to be any specified behavior, but may very well be just threatening in its demeanor or character. Another type of behavior that might be of concern to mall security are persons who have been previously banned from the mall. And finally, any person who conducts themselves in a way so as to cause alarm to the general public and to merchants, employees of the mall, security officers should be dealt with.
Start walking.
East of
Start walking now.
Okay. 513 east of QZR 11 East Region route.
Ejection is a process that is not to be confused with banning. Banning is usually a more formal process and involves written notification of an individual that they are precluded from returning to the mall for an indefinite or specific period of time. When persons are ejected from the mall, it is ordinarily desirable that security officers accompany them completely off mall property to be sure that they have departed. Should the offending person refuse the request to leave the mall, a police officer should be called to arrest for trespass. In the event that the person or persons refuses to comply with the officer's request, changes locations, or in any other way interferes with the attempt to rid the person from the property, the officer should accompany the person or persons, continually updating responding police officers so that the police officer can take appropriate action. Banning is the official process whereby properties notify persons that their continued presence on the mall is no longer welcome. In fact, it signifies that should they return to the mall, that act in and of itself, without any other conduct, would constitute criminal trespass. Ordinarily, persons would be banned from the mall when they have committed an unlawful or felonious act, or when their conduct is shown to be counterproductive to the well-being of the mall, is threatening to the well-being of persons, or in other ways continues to be disruptive in character. In every instance when persons are banned, a report should be prepared which indicates the specific date, time, and particular description of the activity which caused the ban. When persons are banned, additionally, a notice of banning card would ordinarily be prepared, which would include the name, address, age, date of birth, and a physical description and a photograph of the individual being banned. These would be kept in a chronological sequence, which would later be referred to if there was some suspicion that the banned person had actually returned to the property. These reports together could be used in a court of law to establish the criminal act of trespass. Accurate information is very essential in both of these documents. Let's review emergency responses. First, we talked about responding to a fire emergency. Remember, the most important aspect in a fire emergency is the notification of professional firefighters so that they can respond. It's better to notify when there's not a fire than to not notify when there is a fire. The security officer should immediately examine the location of the reported fire to see whether or not any persons are in danger. If they are, steps should be taken to evacuate the individuals involved. The fire department needs to know specific information about the fire when they respond. What is on fire, the size of the fire, whether persons have been injured, and information of that type needs to be communicated accurately and timely to the fire department. A fire responder needs to be told where the fire is by a security officer who may need to position himself external to the building to direct fire personnel to the proper location. Additionally, the fire department should be given specific information as they're responding related to the type of fire and its size and about injured persons. We then talked about armed persons. Persons who are armed in the mall present a particular hazard that can't be ignored by security personnel. They also cannot be effectively dealt with by unarmed security personnel. It is necessary that police be quickly advised when persons are suspected to be armed. The security officer in direct contact with the armed person needs to discreetly and politely discontinue his contact with the armed person. Security officer who has an armed person reported to him needs to go to a location so that he can discreetly and unobtrusively observe the armed person. He should specifically watch for any indication that the armed person intends to use his weapon, and he should also keep responding police updated about where the person is specifically. We then talked about handling unarmed violent persons. And in so doing, we talked about the need for security officers to be present, to approach if necessary, and above all, never to allow any person to become injured as a result of violent activity on the part of any person. We also talked about the necessity for security officers to not restrain except as a last resort. In fact, we talked about the necessity to actually ask persons who may be threatened by the violent person pending the arrival of police to leave, to move to another location. Then we talked about the compliance continuum. The compliance continuum, as you may remember, is something that you may already be doing. However, the compliance continuum we're calling because it involves causing compliance with mall rules using the least intrusive method available. We started out by the simple presence of the officer. The presence of a professionally appearing, well-attired security officer is frequently sufficient in and of itself to cause compliance with the rules and regulations. Secondly, failing the presence of the officer bringing about compliance, we talked about the need for a security officer to politely request that the person discontinue the offending behavior. If that fails, we would then ask the person to leave the mall. If that fails, if they refuse that request, they then have committed what constitutes the acts of criminal trespass, and we would probably ask police to arrest the person. Please keep in mind, the object of the compliance continuum is to cause compliance with the least intrusive method available. But there is never any question that compliance must occur. And in keeping with that, it's necessary that the security officer not break contact with the person until compliance has been gained. Finally, we talked about ejection process versus the banning process. Ejection is the act of temporarily asking a person to leave the mall because of his or her behavior for the balance of the day. That's as opposed to a more formal process whereby an individual is officially and in writing notified that their continued presence or return presence to the mall constitutes the act of criminal trespass. That's our program on emergency responses. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.